Speaker Dave Riddell retains all title, copyright, trade secrets, patents, trademarks, and other proprietary rights in the work provided, including but not limited to the training session presented and all written materials presented in conjunction with the training session, webinar, presentation, as well as in the names, logos, and marks associated with that work, except for the license expressly granted for use within this program to program participants for their individual reference following this program and to LEAD for Pollinators. This is a copyright-protected presentation of LEAD for Pollinators Incorporated and may not be duplicated, shared in any format or on any digital platform or device beyond this one-time share with the paid registrant, Marian Strigel, of the Creating Pollinator Habitat webinar series.
So thanks for having me back. This is part two. I hope you were able to enjoy the first presentation. This is the counterpart. So once again, I'm Dave Riddell, Operations Manager for OPN Seed. Back to chat with you for a little bit about pollinators. And what we're going to focus on today is pollinator habitat installation, management, and growth expectations. So the first thing we're going to talk about now that we discussed, just to rehash what we talked about last time, we talked about site, seed selection, and the preparation process to kind of get you up to this point. So now you're looking at the first thing we're going to discuss is installation. So some of the things that go into that are when do I seed, looking at different avenues, small versus large areas, talking about seed to soil contact, drilling, and broadcast applications. So the photograph here is a native seed drill utilized on mid to large size projects. I'll talk a little bit more about how those work and when those are a good application method later on. So the right time to seed. This is a question we get a lot. And there's really two windows or one large window, depending on how you want to look at it. So late fall, often a great time to seed as you've prepped the area for the full growing season. Hopefully you've got a site that looks something like this one in the photograph, where it's pretty much brown. There's not a lot of thatch on it. Maybe a little bit of green, but nothing too crazy, and it's ready to be seeded. So late fall, you want to focus on when soil temperatures are below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You're looking at the surface, the top soil layer where the seed's going to be placed. When that is in the fall is varies all the time. It's season to season. It just depends on the weather that we're having. You know, some years it's late October, some years it's not until December. So that's something you want to keep an eye on. You never want to seed too early and run the risk of your annuals or any seeds that don't need to be cold, moist, stratified, germinating and then getting killed off because they don't have time to establish. Winter's a great time to seed, whether it's frozen or not. Really, the only rule of thumb there is you can broadcast or apply over snow. I wouldn't recommend doing it if there's more than, say, 2 inches. But actually, if you put it on during a light snow or just before a snow, as that snow melts, that gravity actually forces the seed in and gives you good seed to soil contact. And then the spring. So you can really seed all spring long. A lot of times site accessibility varies in the spring. And you can go up until, we say June 1st to June 15th, depending on the season. You don't want to go after that. Things often at that time get too hot, too dry potentially, and you run the risk of the seed not being able to establish in enough period of time before the fall season hits. So all things to take into consideration. Really, you can start seeding, it's just the ballpark it, mid-November through June. So let's look at benefits of fall and winter installations first. So the first thing is, for most of your native plants, they grow, they produce flowers, they produce seed, The seed falls off in the late summer and early fall, falls to the ground, and you get new growth the following year or so. So you mimic Mother Nature. So that's how the seeds have evolved, and it's a good way to um, just help them along as they fit your project, doing what Mother Nature does. Next, you've got the cold moist stratification of the seed. So I think in the last presentation I hit on this a little bit, but a lot of the perennial species need to be cold moist stratified for a X amount of days, anywhere from 15 days to 180 days, to break down a coating that's developed over time on the seeds to protect them from droughts and heavy rain events and things like that, and predation, so that they actually germinate and start to grow. So by putting the seeds in the fall and winter, you help start that process, and you typically see more species diversity the first growing season than you would if you seeded in the spring. Site accessibility. A lot of times in the fall and winter, you can get periods where the site freezes, makes it more accessible than it would be in the spring when it's continuously wet. That's particularly important if you're trying to get onto the site with machines, so some tractors or UTVs or ATVs, something like that for your application methods. And finally, it fits the timeline of the full year preparation that we preach. So, if you know going in that, hey, I'm going to start my site preparation in the spring, I'm going to continue it all growing season long and roll right into a late fall winter planting. It flows very nicely. It all happens at the same time. Benefits of spring installations. So we just talked about, why the fall winter is important. Now let's look at why you might be beneficial to wait until the spring. So first thing is new seed crop is available. So you're going to have a fresher harvest. So all the species that were harvested, typically what happens is plants are harvested in the late summer and the fall. They're dried, they're cleaned over the winter months, and they become available after they've been processed and tested sometime late winter, early spring. So you have a new seed crop, and you're going to have more species availability. Inevitably, with fall, winter plantings, you run into some species that from the previous year's harvest, since you only get one a year, have run out, and it limits the palette of plants that you can use. One way around that is we encourage people, if you do have a fall planting, to order the seed earlier in the year, and then we can store it and ship it to you when it's appropriate. But in general, you have more availability in the spring. You can control cool season weeds before planting again. So, cool season weeds tend to be the most aggressive. They tend to be the most combative and competitive against the native plants, partially because of when they grow. So they come screaming out of the ground earlier in the year when your native plants are not starting to grow yet, and they lead to more issues with establishment overall. So if you wait till the spring, you can let them start to come up and treat them once or twice again before installing prior to June 15th. Gives you more time to plan over the winter. So think about how you're going to install it. Maybe you need help. You need to rent a piece of machine, a drill or a tractor. You need to hire a contractor. The winter gives you time to think about those things and get all of your processes in a line. And we talked about, you see more species diversity the first year when you plant in the fall, winter, but usually by the end of year 2, things catch up, and by year 3, you would never know if a site was planted in the fall or in the spring. So really, it's a preference thing. It doesn't long term pose any negatives one way or another. So now that we've looked at installation timing, we're going to look at some different size installation and look at some techniques and some pointers for those. So first we're going to talk about small area installs. These are backyards, small commercial projects. When you talk about small in the native planting world, you're probably talking, quarter acre, tenth of an acre, all the way down to 20 square feet. So for installation, we recommend doing it the old-fashioned way. Um, hands and buckets. The broadcast spreaders and other machines that are out there are typically not equipped to handle the size variations of a native seed mix and the density changes between each species, which usually leads to very small seed falling out of the unit and large seed just spinning inside of it. It doesn't give you a very good distribution when you're applying. So putting the mixes in buckets and mixing by hand before you spread is about the best agitation you can get. Adding a seed carrier, this helps because the application rates for native mixes are consistently very much lighter than turf mixes or agricultural mixes that most people are used to. So adding a carrier such as rice hulls or sand helps you distribute the seed, see where it's being applied, and honestly, it just makes you feel like you're throwing more than you are because it's what you're used to. Helps you from over applying. There are broadcast spreaders you can use specifically if you're adding a carrier with the seed mix. It's going to help it flow better, but tread lightly there. You're going to want to calibrate it, try it over concrete to make sure it's thrown at the right method before you move forward with that option. Methodologies for applying it. Like I said, the native seed mixes tend to have smaller application rates than what most people are used to. So separating your project in half or even in quadrants is a great idea. So if you've got a pound of seed, split it into 2 buckets or split it into 4 buckets, add your carrier and, try to do one whole area with the bucket and then work perpendicular to that with the rest of it. It's going to do a couple of things. It's going to help you not run out, and it's also going to allow you to get good coverage. But we get a lot of people that over apply it and run out. One, you're putting it down at a heavier rate than what's recommended, and 2, you're going to run into issues potentially having to reorder seed. So planning it out, separating it into half or quadrants helps prevent that from happening. Planting depth. So native seed likes to be planted very shallow, top 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch tops. So applying it over an area, as long as you have good seed to soil contact, exposed soil is a great way to put it in at the correct depth. Roll it in is a good idea, like you would a lawn. You can either use a traditional roller. If it's spongy enough, just you walking on it is going to push it in. Driving over an area with tractor tires is another way. It just helps solidify that seed to soil contact. And, don't overthink it. Don't get fancy. A lot of people want to use these fancy spreaders and such, but, getting back to the old school method is really the best way until there's more options out there on the market for handling native seed mixes and all of their differences. Mid to large area installs. So these are areas, half an acre or larger typically. Drilling is the best option. It does a couple of things. It calibrates. You can really calibrate the seed mix to make sure it's going into the soil at the correct rate. These native seed drills have boxes that are equipped to handle the different variations in native seed and distribute it equally. And you're also, it's easy to see where you've been as you're cutting into the soil. So you're making sure that not only is the rate right, but the right depth is, and it's visible. So it helps you not over apply. Broadcast application can work. This would be using some of the tools we talked about earlier, like a carrier to go with the seed, really doing your homework beforehand and calibrating it and making sure that the broadcast spreader that you're using is going to distribute the seed the way you want. Keeping track, this is where drilling really helps as well. A lot of tractors have GPS units built into them, so you can actually see where you've been, both on a screen and visibly, as you can see where your cut marks are. It's easy to lose track if you're doing a large install, if you're doing multiple acres. So using some kind of flagging or other techniques, if you don't have the computerized abilities, do it in small sections, a half an acre at a time, so that you can actually make sure you don't over apply and do it at the same area twice. And some of these other things here, better seed to soil contact I hit on, and rate planting depth, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 an inch. I can't go over that enough. At the end of the day, putting the seed in at the right depth and making sure that you're actually getting seed to soil contact and not placing the seed on vegetation is extremely important. A few more things to talk about as we wrap up the installation part of the presentation is, there's a big debate. Do you want to keep individual seeds separately, or do you want to mix them all together? We prefer mixing because, you can keep seeds separate and you can install them separate for a certain look. But unless you're going to put the time in to manage it to look that way, they're going to mix and kind of evolve and grow where they want to anyways, since none of the native plants are genetically modified to do anything but that. So they're going to try to spread and grow wherever they want. So although it seems like a good idea for certain landscape applications, just keep in mind, if you're not going to manage it that way, it's not going to stay that way. Hydro seeding, we get this question a lot, specifically for commercial projects. It can work. A couple of things to keep in mind when you're looking at hydro seeding is the solution. You want to let the native seed distribute in that solution for a longer period of time than turf seed would, just because the application rate might be 10 pounds an acre versus 250. The seeds are smaller typically, they need more time to distribute. So, as long as you treat it a little differently, let the seed distribute in the hydro seed. When you apply it, a lot of times in hydro seed, the ones that we've seen not work, they get buried too deep. So it would be a thin coating, long distribution time in the mix, but it can work. Be smart. Don't overcomplicate it. So, like I said, at the end of the day, we've talked about a lot of things, but hands and buckets work the best on small sites. Simple drill applications work good on larger sites. So you need to be methodical about it, smart about it, but at the end of the day, all you really need to do is make sure that seed's in the soil at the right depth. And finally, planting too deep is an issue that we see a lot. Most people planting gardens, other non-native flowers, turf seed, things like that, all usually like to be planted in that 1-inch depth range, where the natives want to be on the surface. A lot of times that's difficult for people. They think that by keeping it that close to the surface, it's going to wash out or the birds are going to eat all of it. But you really need to get over that thought process, because planting too deep will just smother the seed out and kill it. So we're going to transition now into the management part. So to start off with that, the first thing is assessment. It's always the first step. You've planted, whether it was in the winter or in the spring, and now you've got some length of time before things start to grow up the following season, whether it's out of the seed bank or the seeds that you planted. So you need to assess what's happening, identify what's growing. Is it desirable? Is it undesirable? It's important to keep in mind that things are going to grow out of the seed bank. Things are going to get brought into a project site by birds and other pollinators. But are they really invasive? Are they going to be a long-term problem? Do they colonize and prevent your native plants from establishing, or can they coexist? That's why I use desirable and undesirable, and not try not to use the word weed. Weed is a subjective word. What might be a weed to one person might be desirable to somebody else. So, keep that in mind. And then, based on what you find is happening, you need to develop a plan. You need to set goals and determine, you know, how am I going to manage the things that I want to remove from the site, and how am I going to do that in a timely manner, in a way that's going to help the site establish. Putting together your management plan after you've done your assessment. This photograph here is a nice example. You're going to see things in here that are volunteers from the seed bank. Little growth in this picture that's natives. So this is a good example of diverse habitat of both what you put there and what's volunteering on its own to come up. Keeping in mind that all non-native plants are undesirable. It's really unique perspective to whoever put the project in and what their expectations are. Know the plants that are going to impact the native plants that you put in. There's a lot of different plants that we see repeatedly, but really only a dozen or so that are pose a huge risk because of their growth cycles and how competitive they are. Those are things like Canada thistle, mare's tail, common teasel, different types of clovers, believe it or not, how they grow and expand the first year. So really understanding what you have, and draw a map, because even on small sites you're probably not going to have the same consistent issues all over the project site. Some areas might be a little thicker with undesirable plants, others are going to be thicker with desirable plants. Some areas will be slower to grow anything for a variety of reasons. So drawing a map helps you identify what's going on, and it helps you keep track. Don't be afraid to seek help if you need it. We always tell customers to reach out to us early and often, sending us photographs. We try to help identify. We try to put resources on our website that help them identify the plants that are coming up, so that they can help put together a management plan. And finally, just summing it up, knowing what you have and knowing where it's located on your site is really the key. And then once you know that, you can work by yourself, or you can seek help to help determine the right methodology moving forward to help meet your expectations. So management goals, these are, it seems like a big complicated process, but really it just boils down to a few things. Your goals are typically going to be the same for most people. You want to prevent the undesirable plants from producing and spreading more seed. Most of your plants that are a issue tend to be annuals the first growing season. So a lot of your agricultural weeds and such. So by preventing them from producing more seed and dropping it into the seed bank where they might be viable for hundreds of years is a good idea. And it's going to help you make sure that your long-term establishment takes place the way you want it to. You want to minimize the impact to native species. You don't want to overuse herbicides that might do more harm than good. You don't want to access the site with heavy equipment and crush, tender young vegetation growth that's just starting to emerge. So thinking about that when you think about, the less invasive way that you can control the things you need to control without harming the things that you want to grow. You want to allow light and other resources to reach soil and reach those young plants that are trying to get going. And finally, you want to not overmanage. Believe it or not, it's something that we see a lot. People might misidentify something. I'm going to talk a little bit more about all these things here as we move along. But if you're not sure what it is. Don't pull it. Um, Sometimes there's certain circumstances where you might have a handful of good plants and two or three undesirable plants around it. In those cases, if the plants that you like, the desirable plants, are competing, just let them do their job and outcompete those other plants. So I've talked about management a little bit. So let's look at those techniques. What am I referring to when I'm talking about managing a pollinator habitat? So mowing high for plants to thrive. Uh, you want to use certain equipment, which I'll go over in the next slide. But the idea is to mow the plants that you do not want to produce more seed before they produce seed and get spread all over the place. So usually that involves mowing a site multiple times the first growing season. If they're at 16 inches, cutting them back to 12 inches, not taking off more than 20-25% of the mass of the plant at once. And that's important for a couple of reasons. If there are good plants with them, you're not stunting the plant and kind of taking off so much mass at once, it's going to potentially kill the plant that you want to be there. And two, you're not allowing that seed to drop. And by not cutting a lot of it off, you're not throwing dead thatch everywhere that might potentially lay there and smother out the seed and the young native plant growth that you're looking for. You're looking at spot removal of undesirable plants. This can be through spot treatments of organic or synthetic herbicides. This can be removing them by cutting and removing seed heads from the site. We don't typically recommend pooling because you hardly ever get all of the root mass and you end up disturbing the soil, and soil disturbance typically leads to more opportunistic, undesirable plant growth than good, desirable plant growth. Uh, Large treatments of undesirable plants. This can be, herbicide applications on large projects. If you have, 50 acres you put in, and maybe you have a 1 acre that's overly aggressive thistle that you need to treat because for whatever reason it came up and colonized, and you almost need to start over in that area. So uh, that's something that you need to keep in mind on large areas that you're typically going to have. The project site's larger, so the problems can be larger as well. Tools of the trade. So when I'm talking about the different management techniques, what do you need to do them? So for the mowing applications, you're looking at a flail mower or a brush hog with a PTO hookup on the back of a tractor, so it can be lifted and lowered. It can go up high enough. Your traditional mowers do not go up, they only go up 4 or 5 inches, so nowhere near the height that you need to manage a prairie or native pollinator habitat properly. And if you don't have these readily available, flail mowers, if you are part of a larger organization, government agency, are typically used on ditches and things like that. So a lot of times those are available. You can rent if you need to. But these machines are not only equipped to go on like a tractor so they can be raised high enough to mow at the right height. They also have several blades in them that are designed to basically pulverize the material as it cuts it. So, a turf mower cuts it, lays it down, and now you've got all these dead cut material that smothers out on the ground. These flail mowers and brush hogs, when you mow the right amount of plant, pretty much you have no residual left. A smaller area, you could use a weed whip and a rake. Go in, cut back the tops of the plants that you don't want to produce seed. Take a rake it off. Make sure you get it off the site. So certainly something you can do on a smaller area. Sprayers, this would be if you choose to do organic or synthetic herbicide treatments. You could use a boom sprayer for larger areas to make sure that you're applying the minimal amount necessary, or backpack units so that you can walk through a site and selectively treat small areas. Clippers and bags, these we spend a lot of time with these. So uh, get your little holster to put your clipper in, bag attached to you, and just clip the tops off and bag them and haul them off the site. And finally, a bag of the same seed mix potentially that you put in. If you've got some extra seed, or order a little extra seed, so that if you notice bare spots, or if you if you treat a large area or a clump of something, you can cut it down after it dies and then just kind of sprinkle some seed on top of that to give it a jump start. Just a little trick that we've done over the years, which helps fill in those bare areas. All right, fire. So this is one that everyone's interested in. Rightfully so. It's a great tool to use, and it's a cool process to watch and be a part of. What makes fire a good management tool is most of your native plants are fire tolerant, pretty much meaning that they've evolved with periodic fires in nature and have developed what they need to in order to survive those and regrow, um, to fill in and reestablish a prairie after a fire event. It's a great tool because most of your non-native, undesirable plants are not fire tolerant. So a fire sweeping across an area will kill them off, and typically leads to a flush of native desirable regrowth. If you're thinking about doing a fire, it's not something that it's not going to be feasible till likely probably year 3, because you need enough fuel to burn. Fuel meaning dead vegetation that the fire can sustain an even burn across the site. Because if it hits a big green lush of something or a bare area, it's going to kind of just go out. It doesn't really have any place to go. With all that said, managing fire being a great management tool, it is something that you need to make sure you're doing correctly. Follow all state and local regulations. Get with your local fire department. A lot of times they want to come out and do training exercises because it's something that they don't see often as well. So it allows them to train their staff on these types of burns. There are permits that you have to get in a lot of cases, air quality permits. There are classes and certifications you can get in Ohio. You work with the Ohio Department of Forestry, I believe. You can become a certified burn boss. I believe it's a week or 2-week course teaching you all the different things that you need to know and take into account to do prescribed fire management. Final overall thoughts on management. Assess early and often, making sure that first growing season you are on top of it as things start to grow, to make sure that you don't let it get out of hand before you can take care of potential issues. And you need to assess often, because things are dynamic in these habitats, especially the first year when all these plants are fighting for space, and you need to make sure that you are on top of what is going on, so that if there are potential species that are undesirable and potentially invasive that move in, that you can put together a plan to control them in a quick manner. The first year is definitely the most crucial. I've hit on that a few times, but you've got exposed soil, you've got seed from seed banks, seed being imported, the seed that you put in, and all these different plants are fighting to grow. And that leads to a lot of times chaos, and you need to make sure that you understand what's happening so that you can meet your objectives for your project. Last couple of points here. Give the native plants a chance to compete. They are hardy. They are sustainable for the most part once they're established, and they can compete with even your invasive plants. A lot of times you need to just evaluate a situation. So if you look at this photograph here, you got a beautiful butterfly weed, uh, the monarch on it. In the background there, you can see a Canada thistle plant. So in this situation, it's not worth trying to control that one thistle plant there when you already have native plants growing all around it. Let them work to outcompete it. I see a lot of situations where people come into this and they get so caught up in getting rid of every single undesirable plant that they end up doing more harm than good uh, by damaging the native plants as well. So it's a fine line between eradicating and controlling what you need to, but also allowing the native plants to do what they're meant to do as well. Now that we've talked about management, let's talk about some growth expectations. It's going to take multiple years for your pollinator habitat from native plants to establish, 2, 3, even more years to establish. A lot of factors go into that, such as soils, weather, weed, or undesirable plant competition. The picture here is of a solar field. This is first year growth in Ohio. And they chose to use native to the United States annual wildflowers as a first year cover crop, but also to ensure that they get some color and things the first year. And while your more perennial species establish, that's a great method that you can use. Helps keep weed pressure down. If you have people that you need to report to that aren't as in tune with the process as you are, it allows them to see faster results, which keeps them off your back. Set clear expectations anytime you're working with other people so that they understand that it's going to take 2, 3, 4 years. So everyone's on the same page. We see a lot of times where that expectation is not properly communicated. And after the first year, sometimes management determines that the project was unsuccessful and you end up starting over, which is counterproductive to everything that you're trying to do. Perennials are going to put down the roots before growing up. So just because that first year, if you don't see a whole lot going on, doesn't mean there's not a whole lot going on below the surface. Winter stratification periods. So I talked earlier about the seed needing to be cold, moist stratified for 15 to 180 days. Depending on the winter, we might not get 180 days. We might not get 90 days of freeze-thaw cycles, so that stratification can occur. That's something that as you see trends of climate change that I know scientists are keeping an eye on to determine if that's going to have an influence on how long it might take some of these seeds to actually be in a position to germinate and grow plants. First year weather impacts growth. It's just, you've got the right plant in the right climate zone, but the weather that occurs that first year is going to have a dramatic impact, whether it's hot and dry, cold and moist, anything in between. It's going to impact how fast and how tall that plant might grow. Year one. So the picture I showed you was late in year one, and it was kind of a unique result. Normally, you don't see things that colorful the first year. Normally, you see plants and sites that look like these. You got Monarda fistulosa on the left, Rebecca herta on the first year growth in the middle there, and then on the right, also a first year growth that didn't know it wasn't supposed to flower. So you generally see small growth like this later in the year. So if you see it in the winter, you see it in the spring, you're normally not going to see growth until probably late June into July. Everything's going to be a little bit behind that first year because it wasn't an existing plant that had to emerge from seed. It's going to be a mixture of the species that you put in and volunteer species. A lot of times it's going to be stunted or short growth. As you can see in that middle photograph, it was extremely dry. You got cracked soil. That's where that first year weather comes into play. A lot of times, even your annual species might not flower because they're stunted or they'll flower at a lower height. The things that do come up the first year will typically flower way later into the fall than they're normally going to. So you might have wildflowers that normally flower in July and August that are flowering into early November. That's not something that's going to continue. Eventually, those plants are going to get on their normal life cycle, but it is that way for the first year because of the length of time it takes to get going. Your patience is going to be tested. Um, you're going to wonder if it's working. You're going to think to yourself, I did something wrong. You're going to call us and send us photographs and wonder if it's worth reseeding. Uh, uh, we always tell people to resist the urge to overseed. You got to give it a couple of years here to get going and see what happens. If you overseed, a lot of times you're just putting more aggressive native species in that might, uh, you know, tip the scale of the diversity that you want to see in your site. For example, black-eyed Susans, uh, they come up relatively easily and they tend to spread through sites. So if you overseed more of those into a site, you can actually end up with hardly anything but black-eyed Susans and reduce the other perennial species that were just slower to establish. So patience is the word that we keep preaching. I just made this slide here as another reminder to be patient with the process. You've done your homework. You know how long it's going to take. And even though you might not see what you want to see right away, just be patient, and typically it all works out. You've made it through the first year, and now you're into the second year, and lo and behold, more growth. You're going to see taller species. You're going to see more plants that were part of the mix that came up. You're going to see them come up earlier in the year, and they usually start to get encouraged by what you see as we move into the growing season of year 2. The plants begin to get on schedule, meaning, things that flowered later into the season than they normally would are coming up and flowering as they typically would earlier in the growing season. So these photographs here, you've got some wild rise mixed in with some different wildflowers. Typical of what you'd see, your native grasses starting to come on in year 2 as they've put down roots for the first season. On the right, you've got little blue stem starting to emerge on a year 2 planting. You're going to notice that small areas of undesirable plants are starting to become outcompeted by the native plants. They're starting to take up space. They're getting taller. They're getting stronger, and they're starting to do what they need to do. And finally, the most important thing, you're going to start seeing more insects and bird species than you did the first year, as more species are coming into the site at thicker densities. You're going to start seeing things that you don't know what they are, and now you get to have the fun and enjoyment of looking them up and learning as you go. Year 3, my oh my, you're going to start seeing all kinds of plant diversity, plants reaching mature heights. You're going to start seeing them fill in, expand, even some of them reseeding to some degree and moving about. In a lot of ways, you've made it by year 3. Your maintenance is probably drastically reduced. You're always going to have some level of management normally to keep things from moving in, but at this point, your native plants are pretty much sustainable. On the left here in this photograph, you can see a big colony of little blue stem that was put in at a park as a perimeter to a larger prairie. The other 2 photographs there with good species diversity. You got Rotibita pinnata, black-eyed Susan, Monarda fistulosa, nodding and Virginia wild rise. You know, based on when these photos were taken, these were the dominant species, but there is a lot more diversity there than even these pictures show. But as you can see, if you look way back, you got acres and acres. So there's all starting to fill in. Things are starting to work. And then what is that? You're going to see some of these perennial species that are putting down roots for multiple years start to come up. You're going to see different leaf structures, different flowers, and even more insects and bird species and whatnot than you saw in year 2. So at this point, the prairies and pollinator habitat's starting to look like what it's going to look like long term. This is a slide I love to use, just a representation. And most of you have probably seen this. It's a good representation of what native plant root depths are like. So the one on the far left there with no root mass is normal turf grass, and all these other species are to some degree root depths of natives. And this is why a lot of times you don't see that growth the first year or 2 years even, is they are putting these babies down to anchor into the ground so that they can take advantage of water percolation in the soil. They can become drought tolerant. They improve the oxygen levels, the soil health overall. It makes for a better environment for the soil invertebrates, which are key to the ecology of everything. So just a good visit. Sometimes it's good to see it visually so you can understand how deep and expansive these root systems are. And, I always like to just put a nice, since it's so gloomy and doesn't seem like winter is going to end, put a couple of nice photographs in. Here's an indigo bunting at one of our sites, taking advantage of the plants that were put in. Same thing here, just another nice photograph, grasshopper sparrow, feasting and enjoying the habitat that we created. So mature pollinator habitat, we're winding down here, but now that you're starting to see more diversity, you're going to start seeing more insects that are using the plants because some of them need certain species to complete their life cycle. And now it's coming up, and if you've got it, they'll find it. So I kind of put here they come, meaning just if you grow it, they'll find it. Pockets of paradise. I realize that most sites are small. It's unique to have the ability to do a larger project. So every one of these habitats that you put in is important and crucial because they form corridors for these insects and birds and whatnot to be able to move between as part of their migration pattern. So no site is too small, even if it's 5 square feet, 10 square feet in your front or backyard. Put it in. It's important. Your site by itself is small, but connected to all the other sites is mighty. So if we have everyone doing this, pretty soon we're making a big difference and putting a big footprint out there so that we can help this wildlife move about. Every plant matters. I say that because even if it's something from an aesthetic standpoint that you might be like, well, I could take it or leave it. It's important to a certain species. It's going to need it. So using as many native plants as possible in your planting is important for that very, very reason, and just that because something's going to need it to complete its life cycle. Some final thoughts as we wrap up here. Keep assessing. Like I said, things change quickly. It's a very dynamic landscape. Assessment is the key to making sure you stay on top of it. Watch for introduced undesirable species via wind and wildlife. This is always going to happen each year. More and more things will get brought in. It's important to just keep an eye on them. Make sure it's nothing too bad. If it is, that you eradicate it before it spreads about and becomes a bigger issue. Overseeding a mature area to encourage species diversity isn't a bad idea. Uh, it just always seems like after a certain amount of years, certain species tend to grow better on a particular site just because they like it the best. So coming in with a nice wildflower and grass diverse mix after 3, 4, 5 years and introducing that into a mature prairie is not a bad idea, just so you can continue to diversify it. I always tell people to stop, slow down, and watch. And if you walk through it or you walk by it, it's just going to be, oh, it looks nice. But if you stop and just stare at a flower and put your phone away and focus in on it, you're really going to notice all the life. You're going to start seeing petals move on flowers. You're going to see leaves move. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see something crawl up. And you're really going to be able to understand the thousands and millions of things that are happening in that ecosystem at the same time when you slow down and take a look. And then finally, on to the next. You did one. That's awesome. Now do another one. Do 2 more. Do 3 more. Do as many as you can. So that wraps it up. We are here to help. So my contact information, you feel free to email me at dave@opnseed.com. Visit our website. There's a lot of resources there. Be available right after this for questions and answers. And thanks for having me on. Thanks for listening, and hope we can work together in the future.